What does it look like when art dies? There is very little good art that stands on its own. Our most impactful work is often built on cultural context and shared experience. Much like language, it's cumulative. All of art history is informed by what came before, and over the generations, there have been so many conventions, expectations, and traditions that we take entirely for granted. We often view the apocalypse as this singularity in which life and culture are obliterated and then reborn anew. In our fiction, we like to depict new civilizations discovering our pop culture as a fun sort of Easter egg, but rarely do we engage with the question, what happens to our art after we're gone? We tend to ask, what will we leave behind, and not so much what will happen to it. So I've been wondering, what is the life cycle of art? If our society disappeared today, what would happen to our art, and how would it unravel over time? Everything playwright Anne Washburn pens fascinates me, but Mr. Burns, a post-electric play, is especially intriguing because it forces you to watch the unraveling of a society's culture and art through the lens of something a little pedestrian. Something that would never stand as the height of our civilization's artistic achievement. It's not something that serious art critics will put in the canon. It's no Dostoevsky. It is actually pretty similar to Shakespeare, though. It's The Simpsons. Mr. Burns, a post-electric play, is, at its most simple, a play about how the survivors of a nuclear apocalypse cling on to the Simpsons as a point of cultural contact and shared history. It starts with a group of people, a handful around a campfire, trying to recount this specific episode of The Simpsons. It comes together in chunks, it's disjointed, often out of order, characters struggle to recall specific lines, often misquote things, but they ultimately piece together most of the episode in a way that feels tangible enough to someone who hasn't seen it. Me. Everything you need to know is included here, and by the end of the discussion, we generally understand the premise of the episode, which is Sideshow Bob is sending Bart death threats, and then there's a river and a houseboat and alligators and piranhas. It's not actually very important what the details are, just that they remember details. And it doesn't really matter if you've seen The Simpsons or not, and it might actually be more enjoyable if you haven't. I don't think I've ever actually watched a full episode of The Simpsons, but between the work that the play does and just the bits and pieces I've picked up online, I never felt lost. Unless you know the premise of the play, it isn't immediately clear that the outside world has ended. In fact, it's incredibly unapparent, until the cast whips out pistols and rifles at an intruder. We piece together that some sort of mass nuclear issue resulted in the collapse of the electrical grid, and of course, all of the usual suspects of nuclear apocalypse all coalesce into, the end of civilization as we know it. The second act treats us to the inner workings of a theater company that is rising out of the ashes. Comprised of the same characters as before, it seems society has stabilized enough in order to create art and not just remember it. That said, society is still very unstable, and despite this instability, these people craft art with compulsion. The play never says it outright, but I think it supports a worldview in which art is a form of nourishment. Sure, it's less urgent than food, water, or air, but just as necessary to sustain our identity as humans. In this act, the theater troupe rehearses a play called The Thompsons, which is a cheap bootleg of The Simpsons. However, different to our time, it is a cheap bootleg because the source material is inaccessible due to the lack of electricity, and this is the best people can do to keep its legacy alive. Now, buying lines, individual lines, is, for the most part, the economy of this showbiz, and so the company that we follow has put together this Thompsons sketch, accompanied by the idea of commercials and kind of like a little snippet of MTV. But these things are so divorced from their meanings, stringing dissonant songs together with no relation, simply for the fact that they own the rights to this and not something else. Like a drawn-out game of telephone, our art has been twisted and malformed in the collapse. These characters at least still remember The Simpsons, they remember commercials, MTV, and so first and foremost they're trying to recreate them as accurately as possible, but the act also brings up the question of artistic purpose, of whether or not we should be using art to distract ourselves from the horrors of reality, or use it to reflect the gritty truths around us and give us something to latch onto. One of the actors, Maria, thinks that things are funniest when they're true. I suppose I should read it from the book if I'm going to quote it. One of the actors, Maria, thinks that a richer sense of reality is part of what makes it funny, that things are funniest when they're true. One of the other actors, Quincy, feels strongly that their repertoire should serve as an escape. Because meaning is everywhere. We get meaning for free whether we like it or not. Meaningless entertainment, on the other hand, is actually really hard. It's a good question, one that I think is really important, which kind of sounds dumb to say out loud, but it's ultimately disrupted by a sudden... Art isn't one thing, it's not really even a collection of things. Everything is art. Everything can be art, is I suppose the best way to put it. So when art dies, it's kind of like when a star explodes. It goes everywhere. It's kind of a blessing and a curse. Art that is completely lost to us still informs the work we make today, whether or not we're conscious of it. Literary classics that are slowly fading out of relevancy still remain the building blocks for the stories that we write today. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the, if not the earliest stories that we have record of, and it is generally kind of pointed to as the origin of the hero's journey. But you probably haven't read it unless you have an interest in the classics. That said, it's really good, you should read it. The Odyssey is a little bit more widely read, but reading Twitter after Christopher Nolan's next project was announced proved just how many people haven't read or even heard of it. And frankly, to me it's terrifying that somebody could live their entire life without having even heard of the Odyssey. Though as much as it hurts to imagine foundational pieces of literature like that being lost to time, there is something comforting in knowing that its stardust will forever be embedded in the genre and in literature as a whole. That said, it would be kind of ridiculous to claim that we can truly understand the work the same way that the original audience would have. The core human themes at the center may be timeless. Heartache, grief, love, despair and injustice. We've seen these things throughout all of history. But we can't possibly claim to have the same understanding as the people who lived with it. We may be able to find a full depth of meaning to it, but our interpretation is our own. Speaking of classics, I mentioned Shakespeare when I brought up The Simpsons earlier. Shakespeare has entered this prestigious level of classic literature that is treated as almost sacred, because people reference it without having read it. The truth is, though, that Shakespeare is actually pretty lowbrow stuff. It is incredibly clever and incredibly artful, don't misunderstand me, but it's also very dirty, commoner comedy. I haven't had enough Simpsons exposure to definitively draw this comparison, but I also get the sense that while The Simpsons is very approachable, funny to the highest common denominator, it also bears a mark of genuine artistry and clever writing, stuff that seems ahead of its time. It's both witty and relevant, but also pleasant and charming. Because the American education system is, bad, most people who haven't spent any real time with Shakespeare see his writing as the epitome of fine literature because they don't understand it. If it's too hard to read, that must be because it's really intelligent, smart people stuff. And to an extent, it is intelligent, smart people stuff because of the way academia works and is framed in our culture, but in the 1600s when Shakespeare was writing, that wasn't the case at all. In its time, Shakespeare's work was aimed at the greatest common denominator of people. The royals sat above the stage, there were seats for the wealthy, and the poor could stand in the pit, and piss and shit. Hey, that rhymes. If you left to the bathroom, you'd have to pay another penny to get back in, so people would just relieve themselves in the pit. Or so the tour guide told me. Now, I could point a lot of fingers at the flaws in the American education system or the rise of anti-intellectualism, but it is true that the language Shakespeare used is very different to the English we speak today, and it does require study. Everybody knows the "Wherefore art thou, Romeo" line from Romeo and Juliet. If you had an English teacher who cared, you also know that wherefore means why. But our default expectation tends to be that wherefore is probably just a longer version of the word where that we use today. In order to understand this line, somebody has to teach you that wherefore means why, and that she's asking, why are you a Montague, Romeo? Why do you have to be my enemy? And not, where are you? And this kind of stuff is all throughout the text. Even words that are written the same may have entirely different meanings and connotations today. And so it is a very laborious process to go back and kind of translate this language. This makes directing and performing Shakespeare a somewhat specialized niche. The language is antiquated and unfamiliar to us, and in school, everyone just kind of has to settle for being able to, physically read the words and not actually understand them. So, a high school English teacher of mine, I think, gave up on Romeo and Juliet in the first act and had us watch the DiCaprio movie, and I don't even think we opened our copy of the Odyssey. It wasn't until working on his plays as an actor that I really began to understand the language and how funny it is and how heart-wrenching some of it is. And not until college did I spend any time learning about the historical context, and that's when I realized just how excellent Shakespeare really, really is. I love Shakespeare. It's only been a few hundred years, but Shakespeare's work has been unraveled by the slow march of time. As time gets further and further away from his work, the context and understanding of that time also get further and further removed. People have changed so much that the only way to approximate understanding is through years of laborious study to comprehend what we have gathered about what the world was like at the time. I mean, you have to spend a fairly intense amount of time even learning just to read the language, to say nothing of understanding society at the time, whereas you actively have to try not to expose yourself to The Simpsons today. In this sense, Shakespeare's work is kind of dead art. In order to work with it or enjoy it, some level of scholarly experience has to go into it. Good players can do that work for an audience by understanding the text and delivering the meaning through the acting, even if they're unfamiliar with language. But if that work isn't done, you as the audience member or as a reader have to have a handle on the text to derive enjoyment and meaning from it. That's just kind of... that's how reading works. So, in struggling high schools all across this country, most people never even get a brush with that level of understanding. It isn't so dead that it's inaccessible, but Shakespeare's work holds more of a mythical space in public consciousness than it does a corporeal one. When this starts to happen, we have a tendency to recreate work for modern sensibilities, to reinterpret, to reframe, reimagine, recreate, rewrite. The third act of Mr. Burns, taking place 75 years later, shows us the fruits of decades of post-electric art. While the moniker The Simpsons has been restored, what we're left with is a grotesque approximation of something that resembles The Simpsons. The themes have been entirely repurposed, and the presentation is unrecognizable. All of the characters are there, and this play within a play recreates the events that Act 1 recalled, except the character of Sideshow Bob has been blended into / with Mr. Burns, the nuclear power plant owner. The act takes the form of a operatic musical, and this absurd level of melodrama carries it through to its conclusion. There is no context, aside from the 75-year time skip, as to what this production is, where it's taking place, who is taking part of it, but given the time skip, we can surmise that our original cast has probably passed away, and that a new generation of artists have taken up the mantle. At this point in history, there is presumably no one left alive who has first-hand knowledge of The Simpsons. It's not even entirely clear if the actors or the intended audience would understand or be aware of its nature as a television cartoon. But because the piece is presented in whole rather than in some sort of fragment as the previous act, there's a strength of meaning in the amalgamated work. Before being disrupted, Act 2 asks the question of artistic purpose, whether to use it as a means to grapple with the harsh truths of life, or to escape from them. Act 3 seems to answer this question pretty definitively with meaning. While it is cheap and bizarre, it also hammers home a message about hope with unmistakable clarity. It urges the audience not to give up, to continue to fight to live, to use that life to love. It takes this message very, very seriously, as it delivers it truly as bluntly as possible, with Homer singing, and I apologize, I'm not going to give my rendition of it. "You have to hope when hope is senseless, son. You've got to breathe when breath is useless." Marge sings, "You've got to love when love is gone." And all of the chorus, who are all ghosts, they've been killed by Mr. Burns. Everyone but Bart is singing, "You've got to carry on." I think the choice to write it so simply is really, really effective, because both it contrasts with the rest of the play, which is very naturally and very intelligently written. It says a lot about society all these 75 years later. These are people who are truly desperate for hope, and one of the interesting things in the stage directions for this act talks about how there's a lot of really impressive lighting effects, electric lighting that is at the end of the act revealed to be somebody running on a treadmill to power them. And to our eyes, it's nothing spectacular. It might be a couple of string lights. We would take it for granted, but it's meant to be very, very powerful in the context of this post-electric world, and I think that works really well and comes through very strongly. And these people are so desperate for this message of hope that it is delivered as clearly and as blatantly as possible. It is not obscured under artistic pretenses. It is purely and simply meant to be a message directly to the audience through the oblivious ghosts of The Simpsons. Both literally ghosts and the kind of metaphorical ghosts of our Simpsons becoming something else. The final work is recognizable by its setting, its characters, some of the events that take place, and it is also largely comprised of nonsense lines, references that the actors clearly don't understand, and the musical motif of Toxic by Britney Spears.
Taste of my poison, paradise.
Oh, you love what he does, so it's so very toxic.
These bits are relics of a bygone civilization that have lost all of their original meaning. Yet they endure through a new culture, and to the real-life audience who understand these references, who are familiar with this pop culture, it bears a profound banner of hope, I think. Things may change, they may become unrecognizable, and maybe a little grotesque to our eyes, but they do go on. They will bear new meaning, but so long as there are people, the indomitable human spirit will also follow. And these pop culture references are a bit of a punchline for us, because it's kind of funny to look in onto this culture that treats the lyrics to Livin' La Vida Loca like the Mona Lisa.
I twist and turn and choke
But if you reflect on that, it's because we're so lucky to have more art than we could ever experience in a lifetime that it's amusing to look on this lesser version of ourselves enjoying our scraps. But I find it beautiful that something so ordinary as The Simpsons, something so ubiquitous with our lives, can bear so much profound meaning. Art doesn't need to stay the same. It's actually impossible. An artist can say whatever they want about a piece they've made, but the truth is that interpretation is just as important to the artistic process as creation. I firmly believe that once you release your work to the world, it is no longer solely yours. And if you try to dictate what experiences people have with it, you're missing the point. Art is a lens through which to make sense of the world around us. We trade these lenses with each other when we make and experience art, when we share our feelings and thoughts with others. The subjective experience of art is, frankly, what makes it worthwhile. It wouldn't be exciting to share one universal interpretation of everything. We derive sustenance from the discourse. We are encouraged to explore the fine details of a painting, the individual frames of a film, the patterns in music. And while escapism has its place, to treat it as the primary goal of art is reductive, and frankly, I think sad. If you'd rather escape the world than learn how to love the good parts of it and deal with the bad, why bother at all? Mr. Burns illustrates the powerful connection between time and art, and how influential work can grow and change to speak to the times it finds itself in. The play has heavy moments, and these circumstances are always fairly dire, but ultimately, it is really comforting to be able to see how our work could live on into the future and inspire and aid those who come after us. Mr. Burns, through its 3-act run, follows the trajectory of an unraveling Simpsons down to the point where it is almost unrecognizable. But then, somehow, the fibers find their way back home and wrap back into something. It is not the same Simpsons it was before the end of the world, but it is a beautiful reemergence.